Okay, hello, hi Guernsey, thank you very much Mark, thank you very much Greg for bringing me over here. It's a great pleasure to be here. Not been here before, so really enjoying the weird mixture of English and Frenchness about it. So I'm going to be talking about psychedelic medicine, and in order to do that I need to give you a little bit of a background of who I am and where I got to where I am. So currently I am a child and adolescent psychiatrist working in adult substance misuse, in addictions substance misuse with adults with mental health problems. But I started out my medical career in child and adolescent psychiatry. Worked for 8 years as a consultant with maltreated and abused children, and really it was in that time that I learned that the #1 infection that mental health patients have throughout their lives is trauma, and they catch it very early on through their maltreatment and negative experiences of child abuse. And what happens when those little children grow up? Well, they become difficult, troublesome adolescents, and they become difficult, troublesome adults. And it's in order to do my work as an adult, working in adult psychiatry, one has to be able to recognize that trauma is the root cause of those problems. And I see this trauma in all the mental health problems I work with, from depression and anxiety disorders and PTSD, obviously, but substance misuse disorders and addictions, OCD, even psychosis. When you get down to it, so many of the patients have had these root experiences of trauma. And what's kind of extraordinary about this empathy issue towards this is we, as a society, throw all of this sentimental, gushing care and empathy towards these little abused children, like you see there. These little children who've had these horrific experiences, and we have children in need, and the millions of pounds come in. Well, what happens when these little children become 12 or 13? What they do is they start wearing hoodies and they start smoking a bit of weed. And then when they're 14, 15, they're buying and selling amphetamine. And by the time they're 18 or 19, they're buying and selling and using heroin and crack cocaine. And they are public enemy #1. And the empathy switch in society seems to have switched off. And suddenly we've sort of lost our understanding and our sentimentality towards these people. And that's what sort of really drives me in this whole issue. Instead of empathizing and being sensitive towards these people, we lock them up and we blame them and we malign them. And so by the time I'm working with a 40-year-old, one-legged, HIV positive, HCV positive, homeless, heroin injecting criminal, we've forgotten about that little 4-year-old, but that's what I see before me, this little 4-year-old who before birth had had doors closed to them because of the trauma they'd caught as a young child. So what I'm going to talk about today is the suggestion that psychiatry needs an antibiotic to tackle this issue of trauma. And the pharma industry and the medications that we use, just like we heard from the first speaker, are, in my opinion, papering over the cracks. We are not getting to the root cause of trauma. We are covering things up with antidepressants, mood stabilizers, antipsychotics, hypnotics. All these drugs are useful in their place, absolutely, to manage an acute, distressing and dangerous episode, and I use these drugs myself, but with my patients. But what we don't do with modern psychiatry is get to the root cause of the trauma, because it's very difficult to ask that 40-year-old damaged person to talk about that 3-year-old abused person. But psychedelics, I believe, could offer a key, and it could be what I would be calling psychiatry's antibiotic. So psychedelics are well known and have been used for millennia. Well, we've been writing things down as humans for about 5,500 years, and the very first things we did write down were our use of cannabis. So we could probably assume that we were using them long before we started writing about them. Psychedelic mushrooms, peyote cactus, Amanita muscaria mushroom, the use of cannabis, ayahuasca throughout the Amazonian basin. These are indigenous use of plants and fungi for thousands of years in a shamanic context, like Phil talked about, whereby these drugs are used as sacramental tools for healing, for spiritual purposes, for medical and psychiatric purposes, well recognized. And at the birth of all religions, most likely, including Christianity. There's plenty of scholars who would tell you that the roots of Christianity came out of the sacramental use of psychedelic plants and fungi. So what happened was it really came to the Western attention big time. There was some work with mescaline and nitrous oxide in the 19th century, early 20th century, but it was really this chap, this colourful-looking chap at the top here, Albert Hofmann, Swiss chemist, who came up with LSD in the late 30s and discovered its properties in the 40s. And that spurned an entire wonderful period of exploration, scientific work within psychiatry, in which psychedelic therapy was used to treat mental health problems, particularly neuroses, PTSD-type problems, depression. And it was also explored throughout culture, and we had the whole psychedelic 60s, which sadly brought to an end the psychedelic therapy. And since then, we've had a kind of hiatus, what I would call the psychedelic dark ages, since the end of the 1960s up until about 10 or 15 years ago. And during that time, heavy regulation of these drugs. Now, this is really sad, because for those psychiatrists that were using these drugs in the 50s and 60s, they found them to be safe and effective and really pushing back boundaries for their patients. So we had this dark ages, but what's really exciting today in the last 10 or 15 years is the emergence of a renaissance of interest in psychedelic medicine. And there's a number of reasons why we're where we are now, really. It's, I think a lot of water's gone under the bridge since the 1960s. And the likes of Timothy Leary, whose writing I love, but whose message, I think, somewhat undermined the medical model that we were trying to use with psychedelics. I mean, in a way, things had to happen in the way they are, and the way they did, and we are where we are. But what we're doing now with our modern approach to psychedelics is trying to change hearts and minds, trying to get a balanced, evidence-based approach for clinicians, for the general public, that these drugs are very, very safe and they can be used effectively to reduce the burden of mental distress, particularly in people with trauma. And they are safe. They're very safe indeed. And as David said with his slide here, if you look at LSD there at the bottom, very low toxicity rates. Magic mushrooms or psilocybin, virtually off the scale. You know, the physiological effects of the classical psychedelics like LSD and mushrooms are virtually nil. A little bit of dilated pupils, some slight fluctuations of blood pressure and temperature within normal ranges, but from a physiological point of view, completely inert. So that's an extraordinary drug for pharmacology that can have such a positive effect. And let's not forget what the real dangers are in terms of drug misuse today, and that is the massive overprescribing of medicines. The patients that I have coming into me, they come in, all of them, on the same 5 or 6 drugs. They all seem to be on mirtazapine, quetiapine, tramadol, zopiclone, fluoxetine, diazepam, naltrexone. They're all coming in on all of these, and they just pill-popping, papering over the cracks, trying to live from day to day without addressing the issues of trauma that got them to where they are. Cannabis. David's talked a lot about cannabis, so I won't spend too long on this. And he's talked to us about the 2 main psychotropic compounds within cannabis, tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol, and the balance between these two. And there's a few pictures there of the wonderful work that's happening in the States. 4 states now have recreational cannabis, and about 60% of states have legal medicinal cannabis. And we're seeing these medical dispensaries opening up all over the States, and people coming off their drugs, their other pharmaceutical medications, and using cannabis. And that's a really important point, because one of the old narratives about the harm of cannabis is it leads to harder stuff. It's a gateway drug. There's a wonderful paper that came out a few years ago called Cannabis, the Exit Drug. It's not a gateway drug. It's a drug that you can take to stop taking opiates. People who were using heroin, were using cocaine, were using high levels of codeine as analgesia for their arthritis. They're coming off those drugs now, and they're using cannabis. So we've shifted the debate entirely. It's a much safer drug than the traditional treatments. And David also mentioned spice here. Now, spice is an awful, dreadful product, and for me is the ultimate epitome of the failed war on drugs, that a very safe compound that's been used for thousands of years, because of its illegality, people are turning to a much more dangerous compound, which they think might be broadly similar, and it's actually nothing like cannabis. Which tells us a lot about the CB1 receptor, where we believe THC to work, because these spice products, which are a potent CB1 agonist, aren't really like cannabis at all. The high that one gets with spice, it's an aggressive, agitated, psychotic high, with also lots of nausea and vomiting. And cannabis, in its natural form, is an antiemetic. So it's not really cannabis-like. And it's extraordinary that we've got such a problem with that. This is one of my pipe dreams, is the anti-skunk campaign. Let's get this psychotogenic skunk off our streets. Some of the poorest countries in the world grow the most wonderful natural cannabis. They've been doing so for thousands of years. I have this vision that one day they will be able to grow cannabis as a cash crop and export this around the world. And it would transform these communities, and it would get this awful high THC psychotogenic cannabis off the streets. So who knows? I was saying to David last night, maybe one day you can go into Fortnum & Mason and say, oh, I'll have a bit of Nepalese temple balls and a bit of Malawi gold, a bit of Durban poison. So I don't know, but it sounds fanciful. But why is that so fanciful? We have to remember that this war on drugs business that I've certainly grown up with is only 50 years old. It's a very new social policy, and it's quite nice when we hear the current drug laws nowadays talked about as prohibition. Everywhere people are talking about drug prohibition. That word prohibition is a word that we tend to associate with the well-recognized social political folly of the 1920s and early 30s. Prohibition didn't work. Oh, that was all a very silly experiment. Yes. And now we're looking at this. Now we need to start looking at this current 50-year failed socio-political folly in the same way. It didn't work. Nice idea, maybe in 1971, but it's caused immense problems, and cost the lives of so many people. So the thing about trauma in psychiatry, child abuse, child maltreatment, my opinion about this is that we are now in psychiatry where we were in general medicine about 150 years ago. In the 19th century, we were very good in general medicine at recognizing who got smallpox, who died after operations. People got ill, they got infections, but we didn't know why. And then we discovered the microorganisms, and then we discovered antibiotics, and we transformed medicine. Within decades, medicine was transformed in terms of our ability to save lives. Now, where we are in psychiatry today, as Phil mentioned, we fall over ourselves with our diagnostic and statistical manuals. We know who gets depression. We know who gets anxiety. We know trauma is the root cause of these problems. And we write these big, thick diagnostic manuals, and we categorize things, and our epidemiology is brilliant, and our classification is brilliant, but our treatments are lousy. Our treatments are poor. We are papering over the cracks, and this billion-trillion-dollar business of the pharmaceutical industry is dishing out these maintenance drugs, drugs that don't get to the heart of the problem, but drugs that paper over the cracks. And we're leaving children turning into adults, carrying their trauma all through their lives. So, if you were to invent a drug that specifically worked for trauma, what would it be? I would suggest it would be 3,4-methylenedioxymethamphetamine, MDMA. And this is a drug that I've found through going through all the different psychedelic drugs over the years and looking at them all and their effects. MDMA is the one that interests me the most. It's short-acting, it's less perceptually disturbing than the classical psychedelics like LSD. It's invariably pleasurable. That's very important. It makes it a very good clinical tool. A drug like LSD or psilocybin could go either way. It could be ecstatic or it could be hellish. And you have to take great care. A drug like MDMA, it either works or it doesn't work. And if it works, it's tolerable. It's very safe, despite what you will hear in the media. I mean, the media have a very good way of blowing things out of proportion. The number of column inches dedicated to ecstasy deaths far exceeds any other drug, which is extraordinary. We have 500,000 young people taking MDMA every weekend for the last quarter century in the UK, and we have death rates of probably about 5 to 10 per year. And these could all be avoided if the drug was taken in a way that's safe, and that would be avoided through drug education. Now, but the absolutely most important thing about MDMA is this ability to access repressed emotional memories, think about, dwell on the trauma that's been experienced, but not be overwhelmed by it. And it has an extraordinary power to do that. And seeing patients taking MDMA and being able to address this trauma. I see MDMA as this kind of life jacket to wear to go into battle with your trauma. People can sit there who have had experiences of rape 20, 30 years earlier and never been able to do trauma-focused psychotherapy, and they can sit there and talk in great detail about the experience they had for the first time in 30 years. The tears are streaming down their face, and it's not an ecstasy experience, it's a terribly distressing experience, but it works, and they can, for the first time, tackle these issues. And what's really important about this, if you look at the way it works, this is not taking MDMA every day. This is not like sitting on an SSRI or mood stabilizer or antidepressant drug. This is a dedicated course of psychotherapy, 8 to 10 weeks of weekly sessions of psychotherapy, 2 or 3 of which involve MDMA, and the others are non-drug therapy. So you get to the end of your course and you're cured. Now, the cure word is not a word we use in psychiatry. We've got used to psychiatry being a palliative field. We've become used to understanding that if you're diagnosed with anxiety or depression in your teens, you'll probably have it when you're 90. That's an awful situation. And the reason we've got so used to that is because our treatments don't treat the root cause. And what we've got here is an opportunity, low cost, safe, efficacious treatment with focused, guided psychotherapy to get to the root cause of trauma. And we have to remember, let's just leave that ecstasy word out of this. Clinical MDMA is not recreational ecstasy. So people say, this is ridiculous. What are you talking about, giving LSD, magic mushrooms, cannabis, and MDMA to sensitive psychiatric patients? What I say is, well, look, we already give people methadone, buprenorphine, methylphenidate, carbamazepine, clozapine, methotrexate. We saw their legs out, we remove their bowels. We do the most horrendously invasive things in medicine. It's not as though medicine is non-invasive. It's about risk-benefit analysis. And when I offer any treatment to a patient, whether it's a sticking plaster or chemotherapy for their cancer, I sit there, look at the patient, and weigh up costs and benefits. Now, I believe that MDMA, 125 milligrams of MDMA on 2 occasions, spaced 3 weeks apart, under medical supervision, absolutely satisfies the benefit part. And what are the risks? Very, very minimal indeed, and they can be kept right down to a 0 with careful planning. And if the outcome is the treatment of resistant PTSD, these patients who for 20 or 30 years have been on every single psychiatric medication in and out of hospital, being sectioned, trying to harm themselves, trying to kill themselves, becoming addicted to alcohol and opiate drugs as a way of numbing their pain, if those couple of doses of MDMA can do something to impact on that, then by God, that satisfies the risk-benefit analysis. So the general public find this difficult to take on board, though, but surely MDMA is dangerous. Well, it's just not. It's just not. It's a very safe drug, but we have such an uphill battle, and that's an unlevel playing field for you there. So we have this renaissance. We have wonderful groups all over the world. I've co-founded and chair a large psychedelic conference. We had 802 people come in July to our meeting in London. We have these groups that are coming out of the woodwork and talking about psychedelic research. And it's evidence-based. These are not just a bunch of crazy hippies. These are doctors and nurses and psychotherapists and psychologists and politicians and the police and parents, people who are recognizing from an evidence-based perspective that this stuff works, it's cheap, it's efficacious, and I don't consider this a controversial or subject at all. What I consider incredibly controversial and incredibly unethical is that there are barriers to this, research. Now, that really is unethical because it's the patients who are missing out. And we have major institutions around the world, like major university departments. When I first came into this field 10 years ago, I was a trainee at the time, some of my tutors would say, well, Ben, what are you doing? Aligning yourself with this crazy left-wing fringe field. This is career suicide. Why don't you go and study antidepressants or something? And quite on the contrary has it been career suicide for me. It's blossomed my career. I've come to lovely places like Guernsey to talk. Peer-reviewed papers, books written. People are really interested in this stuff. So I urge any of you young people in the audience who are maybe on the fringes of any kind of healthcare or politics or law or anthropology or sociology or this psychedelics cross all these barriers, get involved in this subject. This is where mainstream neuroscience is going. It's not a fringe. The major university departments all over the world have now got psychedelic departments. It's where things are going. And in the UK, we've had some wonderful project over the last few years, starting with the project David and I did in Bristol with psilocybin, and then with lots of imaging projects, because we're getting a chance to see how these drugs work in the brain. We're doing an MDMA project in Cardiff next year, looking at this relationship between PTSD trauma and how MDMA reduces the fear response for trauma in patients with PTSD. And we're looking at an alcoholism project next year as well with MDMA, giving MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, like I described, 2 or 3 sessions over an 8-week course of therapy to see if we can increase rates of abstinence for alcoholics. And I don't know much about the politics of Guernsey, but what I do understand about the Channel Islands is that you're fiercely independent and you like to sit outside of the EU and you like to sit outside of the UK and you like to do your own things and you are innovative and you are brave and you don't have to do as they say in Westminster. You guys have a terrific opportunity here to be ahead of the curve. This will happen. This will happen in medicine in the future. It is going to happen. It's only a matter of time before the British government looks at the massive amount of green dollars that are being made in the States with cannabis and looks at, I mean, we want to empty our psychiatric hospitals. We want to treat people. We want to stop just maintaining their illnesses. And sometimes when I look at the pharma industry, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. You may think I am because I'm interested in this field, but it sometimes feels as if they sit around the table at GSK and say, what maintenance drug can we come up with next that's not going to quite get people completely better, but they'll have to keep taking it every day. Now that means this is the antithesis of that. You take the drug 2 or 3 times and you are better and you come off your medications. Now that makes an enormous barrier for this research. Money. It's money. The likes of GSK, they can afford to throw 20 million at this product, 20 million at that product, hoping one of them will stick and they'll have a saleable product that can be used for maintenance therapy for years and years. Who's going to pay for psychedelic research, you know? Who's going to throw the $20 million at psilocybin, MDMA, cannabis, LSD? These drugs are off patent, nobody owns them. You don't even have to use them that many times and you get better. So money is the barrier, it really is. And it will take someone cleverer than me to work out the economics of it. But I don't really want to get too involved in that. I care about the plight of my patients, and it's an absolute travesty that this research is grinding along so slowly for lack of funding and because of an erroneous belief about risk that's been propagated from 50 years of a drugs war that was put about for socio-political reasons and has failed. So there we are, Breaking Convention 2015. 802 interested psychedelic researchers from around the world. And I think I'll leave you with this, which was a placard at a recent pro-cannabis lobby. What I want you to take away from this was that guy Ben was a really good, sensible, sober, hard-nosed scientist. Not that guy Ben was some crazy mad hippie who says we should all take ecstasy and live in chemical utopia. That is not the message. Hard, evidence-based practice. That is what works. The data is in. It works. We just need to change hearts and minds. Thank you.